Thank you. Well, I never liked binary choices. I can still remember quite vividly when I was a young boy, my mother used to ask me before bedtime who should tuck me in, mommy or daddy. And I thought that was a terrible choice. I was a small boy, but I felt torn apart. Were there really no other options? What if mom gave me a good night story and dad gave me a good night kiss? And I'm not just talking about being unable to make decisions. I'm talking about the availability of more nuanced alternatives. Alternatives that could lead to less division, less conflict, and more freedom of choice. Well, today's society seems more binary than ever, right? For example, everyone in need should be welcomed in our country versus close the borders, no more immigrants. Or we need to act now and save our planet versus climate change is a hoax. It's the fake news. We extremely think in terms of extremes, left or right, progressive or conservative, globalist or nationalist. That's why I'm committed to break through binary thinking in society and thereby combat polarization. Now I can hear you think, but polarization is timeless, right? And well, it absolutely is. For example, think of the division over the Vietnam War in the 1960s, which led to mass protests and conflicts. But something else seems to be going on. Research shows that the share of Democrats who think very negatively about the Republican Party has more than tripled within 2 decades. And the same goes with Republican views on the Democrats. But these stories of these numbers don't even tell the complete story, because from the people who have very negative feelings of the other party, the vast majority indicates that they see the other party as a threat to the nation's well-being. And that is a worrying development. Because after all, you conduct a debate with your political opponent, but you wage a war with your political enemy. And the storming of the Capitol earlier this year made this painfully clear. And now you could say, well, that's America, right? With their polarized thinking. But the same feelings also exist in countries like in the Netherlands. 75% of the Dutch people feel scared about the increasing polarization of society. But the same research shows, in the sidelines, that the actual polarization isn't changing. So how is it possible that people feel more polarized while the actual polarization isn't changing? And the answer is actually quite simple, because polarization works. And there is one thing that even sells better than sex, and it's fear. According to Edelman's Trust Barometer, the people who voted in favor of the Brexit voted out of fear, compared to just a quarter of the people who voted to stay. And actually, we are neurologically wired in this way. Brain research shows from Brown University that polarized brains share an intolerance of uncertainty, regardless of political preference. So a lot of politicians are very keen to feed this fear and uncertainty. And instead of hope for the future, longing for the past is created. For example, the pro-Brexit slogan was, "Let's take back control." And Trump's campaign was, "Make America Great Again." So campaigning today means making your opponent look as bad as possible. And that's not just a thing from the right wing. For example, Joe Biden launched a Twitter campaign against Trump, and I quote, "Nearly 100,000 lives have been lost, and tens of millions are out of a job. Meanwhile, the president spends his day golfing." So the political theater has turned into an arena where modern gladiators compete with each other with words instead of swords. And the media feasts on it. Instead of watching over democracy, they often throw oil on the fire, just like big tech's algorithms. Facebook intentionally shows us content that makes us angry, because based on their own research, Angry people stay longer on the platform and click on more links. In other words, polarization is big business. And you might say, well, our democratic tools are our salvation, right? But actually they're not. They reinforce this division. They either have a binary design or stimulate a binary outcome. For example, election compasses, agree or disagree. Referenda, in favor or against. And even electoral systems, Democrats, Republicans. And I would like to call this division by design. There is no room for a moderate opinion in today's democracy. We are forced to choose between extremes. But when we look at solutions, it's important to realize that bad behavior isn't caused by bad people, but by bad systems. So for the past 6 years, I've dedicated myself to the redesign of democratic tools. For example, windmills is an increasingly polarizing topic in the Netherlands. And this might come as a surprise to some of you because we Dutch love our mills, right? And this is a story about Venlo. It's a medium-sized city in the province of Limburg in the south of the Netherlands. When the government exposed their plans that 9 new windmills had to be built, the people of Venlo were not amused. So they expressed their opposition through protest and petitions. Now, you could conclude that the people of Venlo are not very fond of sustainability. But that's not a fair analysis, because when only 2 options are presented, you can't really blame them for being against it, because a windmill might end up in their own backyard. And I wondered, what would happen if we offered people more options, multiple options? So I decided to put this idea into practice, and I created an innovative election compass for the Dutch elections in 2019. Instead of binary questions, binary statements, people could choose from 5 different concrete alternative solutions. In the end, more than 1 million people used this voting aid. And as it turned out, the vast majority were in favor of placing windmills in parks together, along highways, as long as they didn't have a negative effect on the environment. And only 10% of the people of Limburg were against windmills. So this means if we give people more nuanced alternatives, they will also get more nuance in their answers. So more variation leads to less division. It's a beautiful paradox in which contradictions are united. And these insights are now also scientifically supported by research from Tilburg University. So they created a shadow referendum. And instead of 2 options, people were presented with 4 alternatives. 2 of them represented the in favor and against, but the other 2 were more alternative solutions. And as it turned out, by approval voting, the alternative solution got the most support. And far fewer people voted against than in the binary referendum. So a vote against doesn't always mean that they are opposed. And I was curious whether these insights would also apply in other countries. So I created an interactive voting experience in Design Museum Holon in Israel. And the country was so divided that they had to go to the polls 3 times within 1 year. And together with a local designer, we created this interactive installation where people could use stickers to indicate their point of view on pretty sharp topics, such as the status of Jerusalem and LGBT marriage. And here too we see that people take less extreme and more corresponding positions, as long as nuance is offered. So we are not as divided as we think. And it made me wonder, what if there were more options in the EU referendum than leave or stay? Would there still be a Brexit? And what if politicians and media didn't only focus on the extremes? Would there still be as many violent protests? And what if, in the future, we would no longer accept binary systems? Will there still be this much division and inequality? Personally, I want to live in a world where politics unites instead of divides, where expressing an opinion doesn't mean excluding another opinion, and where people are no longer forced to choose between extremes. So in other words, I want to live in a world where friends and family can sit at the dinner table again without getting into a fight. So here's what you can do for yourself. For example, a topic such as immigration. Suppose you are in favor of including immigrants. First of all, I think it's important to realize that if someone expresses negatively about immigration, this person is not by definition anti-immigration. Because here too, when only two options are offered, you can't really blame the people for being against it if they have some reservations. And instead of convincing the other that you are right, try to take a step in their direction by showing the alternatives. Because it is possible that people would be open to it if the share of immigrants would be spread across the country more evenly, or when immigrants would get a basic income so they can provide for themselves. So even behind the sharpest positions often are more nuanced interests, which stem from values that we can all agree on. So you probably all know the iceberg metaphor, right? So our behavior is just the tip of the iceberg. Underneath the surface are interests and values, and it's a place where we can find common ground. So if you ever come across Dutch people again who are against windmills, then don't just write them off as anti-sustainable, but engage in a conversation. Ask them about their values. And perhaps this is a scary thought, but you might just agree with each other. Thank you.